Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Fast Forward series. It's great to have you here and it's great to be back. My name is Dr. Lee Beattie. I'm the Deputy Head of the School of Architecture and Planning and also the Director of the University's Urban Design Program. So it's actually great to have you here and it's great to have us, as I say, back. Before I go any further, I'd just like to thank and acknowledge the sponsors, JIB, for their kind support. Also like to acknowledge the kind support we've had from alumni services, including Neve, Brent and Alette, for their kind service to get us back onto the air. So it's great to be here. And tonight we have the Right Honourable Julie Anne Genter, who's the Associate Minister for Transport, and she's going to be talking to us about the shovel-ready projects and how that's going to achieve Auckland's urban growth strategy and housing agendas. Julie Anne has quite an distinguished career, and I'd just like to say is an alumni of this school, so it's a pleasure to have her here today. She's also a graduate of BC Berkeley, and she's also been studied overseas in France as well. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. What we're going to do is we're going to have a presentation from Julie Anne, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. So please feel free to just add on some questions, put into the Q&A sessions, and we'll work our way through them. And the ones that get the most amount of votes or the most strongest ones we'll put forward to Julie Anne. And I have to say, being in the position I am, I'm going to ask her a few questions before we start with the open floor. But as I say, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And Julie Anne, as I say, it's an absolute pleasure to see you again. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to you. And thanks for the opportunity again to take some questions from us as we go along.
Thank you very much, Lee. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. It's really lovely to be able to speak to all of you. If somewhat unfortunate that I can't be in the same room and see all of you, hopefully we can still have an interesting discussion. And while I will start with a bit of a presentation, I do really want to be sure there's plenty of time to answer questions and direct the conversation in an area that you would be interested in. As Lee said, I actually came to New Zealand to do my master's in what was then planning practice at the University of Auckland and is now the Masters of Urban Planning, I believe. And before that, I studied politics and economics in France, and I'd studied philosophy and other things in the United States. And one of the key questions or things that motivated me to study urban planning was that I really wanted to have a career where I could make a positive and creative impact and where I could help solve some of what I saw as the biggest challenges facing us, like climate change, environmental degradation, and getting better equality, better outcomes for all people in our communities. And I saw urban planning as a really fascinating and interesting discipline that started to look right across a lot of different areas and where we could potentially get much better outcomes environmentally, socially, from a public health perspective, and from and even an economic perspective. So I'll just share some slides now, and hopefully this will work. And apologies if it doesn't, because this is the first time I've shared slides. So hopefully what you can see here is what I think is quite a useful encapsulation of the difference between equality versus equity. And equity is something that I think we need to be aiming for, not just in the design of our buildings, but in the design of all the different aspects of our public life and our civic life. In the first, if you give everyone the exact same thing, not everybody has the same opportunities to live a good life because people are born with different abilities and different physical characteristics. So it's really important in the design of our towns and cities that we're thinking about ways to maximize the ability of everyone to have a fair go. And I particularly focused on transportation during my master's in planning because I saw that as an area where if we did things differently, we could get much, much better outcomes from an equality and equity point of view. Let's see if this changes. So the sorts of places that I think people are inevitably attracted to are ones that are designed around people. And you know, when you create these spaces, as we used to have in all of our towns and cities, this is where the commerce flocks to, this is where people go to engage in socializing and shopping and recreation, and it's often places where they work and where some people would really like to live. This is Christchurch. We don't have in New Zealand many places like this in our towns and cities, and we certainly didn't when I first moved to New Zealand, because most of our public spaces in our towns and cities had been given over to cars and trucks. And that inevitably kind of drove people out of the city center, and they tended to flock to other car-free spaces like shopping malls, out-of-center shopping malls. And I think there's a real renaissance of the city and a desire for people to get back there. And that's something that we absolutely can support, but we will need to take a different approach to both our urban planning rules and our transportation policy if we're going to support these sort of urban, people-friendly environments that reduce the need to rely on private vehicles for so many of our trips. So in transportation, there's really kind of two big areas. One is passenger trips, and those are the trips that people are taking to get to school, to work, around town. And then there's freight. And freight is a pretty big and important question in New Zealand, particularly for our exports, which tend to be coming from parts of the country where there isn't a huge amount of infrastructure. You know, if you're thinking dairy in Southland or forestry on the East Coast. So freight is something that we do have to look at as how we can reduce our carbon emissions and reduce pollution from freight. And I think there we have a great opportunity as well. And as I alluded to earlier, what I found most interesting when I was doing my research for my master's in planning was that, contrary to a lot of the assumptions about why things are the way they are and why in New Zealand people are so reliant on private vehicles to get most places, it's not because planning hasn't been good enough. It's actually because planning and traffic engineering in the second half of the 20th century actually led us to this outcome. Unintentionally really created towns and cities that developed entirely around car transport through some of the planning rules, which separated zones and said, you know, you've got to have residential separate from commercial, separate from, so people don't live where they work. And transportation planning, which really entirely focused on car journeys and truck journeys, as opposed to what is the best way to offer people opportunities to move around, and what is the best way for goods to move around. And inevitably, what we know now, and this wasn't unique to New Zealand, this happened in everywhere, but especially it came out of North America, the United States, Canada. You can even see that the UK has more car-oriented planning, despite having much older cities than some of their neighbors in Europe, who maybe changed tack a little bit sooner. So Australia and New Zealand, similar to North America and similar to, you know, to all those English-speaking countries, you know, chose a particular way of defining the problem and solving it that inevitably leads to widening of roads, more provision of parking, trying to reduce traffic jams at peak time, trying to reduce competition for on-street car parking. And what this inevitably does is create a situation where you have to use a car to get anywhere, and you end up having more traffic, and you're constantly in this cycle of thinking, oh, if only we just widen this road, we would alleviate peak congestion. But 50 years of research from North American cities, and you'd see the same in New Zealand and Australia, is very definitive that you can't build your way out of congestion. What is missing in the design of our towns and cities and transportation system has been a real focus on the safety and convenience of trips by bicycle, on foot, by public transport. And when we start to provide for those missing modes, then more people will use them, and there'll be less pressure on the roading network that we've already developed. And of course, despite improvements in vehicle technology, New Zealand is lagging behind in terms of not having vehicle emission standards or any sort of taxes or incentives to buy cleaner cars. By cleaner, I mean less carbon emissions carbon intensive cars. And because our car ownership is quite high and has been increasing, we've seen from about 2013 a big increase in our transport emissions at a time when we're meant to be reducing emissions. So from a climate perspective, transport becomes incredibly important because, as some of you may know, about half of our greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture and the other half are carbon emissions. And about 40% of our carbon emissions are from transport, and more than half of all of those, about 60%, the majority, are from light cars, cars, utes, vans, the light vehicles in our fleet. They're not, I mean, heavy vehicles are about over 20%. So we need to take some pretty drastic action to change that over the next 10 years if we have any hope of meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement and keeping doing our part to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, which most of the world has already agreed to. And many of you might already know, these decisions that were made a long time ago in Auckland around Spaghetti Junction, when we were prioritizing just getting vehicles from the suburbs into the city center, inevitably that creates severance, and it makes it more difficult for people to make relatively short journeys, say by bicycle, because they're having to compete with all this traffic. There's no dedicated infrastructure for them. And so you'll find it's really intriguing. I saw that a data analyst who I know published a bit of an analysis of trips within Auckland. And although you might expect that people driving to the city center would be coming from far away, in fact, I think far more disproportionately, people who are driving to the city center are people who live in those inner suburbs like Remuera, St. Mary's Bay, Herne Bay, Ponsonby, who are very high income and who are likely to be provided a free car park by their employer in the central city. So those are journeys that you would think could be made pretty easily by public transport or by e-bike now. But because we don't really have the infrastructure, public transport still isn't as convenient. And ultimately, driving is a very easy option for people on high incomes or who are provided a free car park in their place of work. Those are the people who are driving. And of course, again, that vicious cycle of as long as lots of people are driving, there's heavy traffic, there isn't dedicated infrastructure for the alternatives, then that puts people off actually trying the alternatives, and you end up with congestion. And this slide here is botany out in Auckland, and I think it's almost the quintessential outcome of the 1950s to 1970s planning and traffic engineering paradigm. This is the outcome you get, where you can see the vast majority of what's in the picture is land being used to move or store vehicles. Probably worth noting at this point that the off-street car parks you see around this big box retail, this sort of development is a necessary outcome from the planning rules themselves. The planning rules would not enable a type of development that we know would be far more amenable to people walking, cycling, and taking public transport. The minimum parking requirements require a huge, really over provision of car parks because you're planning for the peak. And an off-street car park uses about 20, much more land than an on-street car park would. So even if the car park was full, you'd still have at least twice the land needed for storing the vehicles so that the vehicles could circulate around the car park. So the outcome of this is an environment where it's basically extremely unattractive or impractical for people to do anything but drive a car. The cost of this development is higher because of all the land that we've put aside for car parking. It reduces the land that's available for affordable housing, which is something that is important to us, particularly in Auckland. And ultimately this, you could argue, is not only a disaster for the climate, it's kind of a disaster economically, because even if we could replace all of the cars in the picture with EVs, the cost of that is going to be very, very high. and the cost of the land being used simply to move and store cars, as opposed to really vitally important uses like housing and other social infrastructure that's needed for communities to flourish, is very, very high. But the great news is we can choose to do all of this differently. We don't have to force people out of their cars. We do need to prioritize investment in alternatives so people can get out of their cars when they want to. And over the last 10 years, I know that developments in public transport in Auckland have been quite good. We've seen huge growth in public transport use everywhere we've invested in it. It has been, hi, sorry, this is my son. He's just saying goodnight.
Okay, come on, big boy, let's go to Dad. Bye bye, Mom.
Say bye-bye. Hi, I know you want to be on the screen too. I want to design towns and cities for people like him, not just so he grows up with a stable climate, but also that he has the independence when he's 10 years old to be able to go out with his friends and get around without having to rely on me driving him everywhere. I think that's the kind of independence that people took for granted in previous generations, and that children today are absolutely lacking in a physical environment like the one where we're looking at right now in Botany. Nobody could let their child go down to the shops for them, because they would have to cross incredibly dangerous intersections with high volumes of traffic. It would be a much longer walk because there aren't shops provided really close to the houses, because they're all spread out because of the roads and the car parking. And so if we have to change something, basically. And I guess the other element of the equity as a Minister for Women I do have to comment on is that transport networks have largely been designed by adult men for adult men. And a more family-friendly and inclusive approach to designing a transportation system wouldn't uniquely focus on the commute trips, but actually the household trips that women are more likely to make, the short trips within the community to go do the shopping, to take the kids to school. Ideally, the men would be doing this too. But again, this is why I see this just very much as the product of a framework that was very mid-20th century. And still there is quite a gender imbalance within the transportation side of transportation planning. Traffic engineering is still very male dominated, although I think planning is a bit more diverse at this point. So no one in their right mind. I mean, obviously this girl is cycling, but it doesn't look like a very nice environment for her. She's all alone and unlikely to, this is why you don't see huge number of kids walking and cycling to school anymore, as we did in previous decades, is very much because the transportation system has been so focused on cars and has led to higher volumes of traffic. Understandable that families wouldn't feel comfortable letting their kids walk and cycle to school on their own in this environment. Maori and Pacifica kids are at higher risk of being killed or injured by road traffic. And you can see, particularly in Auckland, in communities like South Auckland, there's fewer parks, there's less public transport provision, and it's a far more car-oriented design than Central Auckland. And a big focus on the infrastructure investment over the last decade on improving cycleways and stuff has been very much on that central city and not the whole city. And I think that we have to do a lot more to ensure that we're focusing on investing in the communities who are disproportionately impacted by the traffic that we have and by the transportation poverty that they have, because we haven't focused on delivering. So my biggest takeaway, and many of you may already know this, but is people respond to the environment that we create. So planners and engineers and politicians have an enormous responsibility. We don't have to force people out of their cars, but we do have to provide a transportation system that is providing equity of access and is creating the types of communities that are really going to serve our people, and all of our people, not just some of them. I did mention earlier, and I've slightly lost track of time, so I hope I'm not going over, that everywhere we have invested in public transport, people are using it. It's been more successful than forecast. The Northern Busway is a really great example of an incredibly efficient investment. You know, I think it was 200 million at the time. And it's basically doubled the capacity of the Auckland Harbour Bridge at peak times and has enabled much better access for people who don't own vehicles. And I've come to the end of my slides, so I will stop sharing. Or it's frozen. I haven't quite figured this out. I'd be really interested in getting into questions just to make sure that I'm addressing all the particular issues that the audience is interested in.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting stuff. And I really like your comment. And as an urban designer and an urban planner, you know, we design communities, design for the car, that's what you get. And I take your point, it's really good. I'm going to start, I've got 3 questions here, but I'm going to start with one question that I didn't say I was going to ask you, but you made me think about this, is that in light of the scenario that we've been in and the lockdown and all the whatever you want to call it we've been through, it seems to me there's a real opportunity here to return to the local and actually deliver on a lot of these ideas about TODs and live, work and play and all those types of things in the walkable, catchable communities. So I'd be sort of interested in your role as the Associate Minister of Transport, is how we could give effect to this idea opposed to these investing in these sort of these mega infrastructure projects that move people from one side of the city to the other. No disrespect to the engineers, they love those types of projects. But as an urban designer, community creation, and how do we get back to the local? I'd be interested in your thoughts on where you think we could go to do that.
I think that's a really great point, Lee. I think that our government has taken some important first steps to enabling that. And as I was talking a bit about planning rules that have gotten in the way of more diverse, compact development, as long as I've been in New Zealand, the planning documents have had a vision for walkable neighborhoods with good public transport and a variety of different activities within walking distance of where people are living. And yet the rules that were kind of governing how development happened tended to prevent that from actually being implemented. And, you know, there were some positive changes with the Auckland Unitary Plan, but I think it didn't really go far enough. And so we have been working on a national policy statement on urban development that does address some of those barriers to that type of development. And I think we've also been trying to use the you know, the national agencies like the New Zealand Transport Agency to provide guidance and support to councils. So I think there'll be an announcement about the final decisions on the national policy statement in the coming weeks. So that's something you should definitely look out for. The idea behind it is just to say, actually, in the Town and Country Planning Act and the old school approach to planning, there were a whole bunch of rules like minimum parking requirements that just kind of got put in place without any evidence to support them. We know they've had really, their impacts have not been what we want. And for each council to try and change those individual rules is really quite a huge hurdle, and there's quite a big barrier. In Auckland, when they tried to remove minimum parking requirements from high density zones, the major retailers took them to court over it, and they ended up having to settle. And the reason the major retailers did this is because even though they themselves, and I'm talking like Sylvia Park, the owners of Sylvia Park and some of the malls, they themselves would apply for dispensation from these rules to provide huge numbers of car parks when they wanted to expand their floor space. But basically, they sort of saw that it was a bit of a threat to their business because the malls thrive on this car-oriented model. And if in the high density zones, retailers were able to set up smaller shops without putting in place car parking, which is kind of the point, right? Because we want them within walking distance of these new higher density townhouses and apartments. Well, the major retailers just knew that that would be a bit of a threat to their business models. So they were saying, don't regulate us on anything, council, except you definitely need to tell us how many car parks to provide, and you should definitely tell us to provide more than we've actually argued to you we need to. So not to dwell too much on the parking rules, but I do think that they have been one of the biggest drivers of the shape of our urban development over the last 50 years. So it was a bit of a barrier for councils to make that change. And I'm hoping with this new national guidance that it will really kind of be a bit of a circuit breaker on that and support councils to actually have the type of development that they say that they want. And then of course we have to pair that with some guidance from something like the the New Zealand Transport Agency saying, here's best practice management for car parking, and we're going to support you to take a more management approach as opposed to just regulating an oversupply of car parking. And another area where that's true is with the Tactical Urbanism Fund that we've developed at the NZTA. So that's also trying to overcome a barrier. I imagine many of you know about tactical urbanism. This is using like very low cost materials like brightly colored paint and street furniture and pot plants and things like that to take over space that has previously been street space for the movement of cars or even on-street car parking, and turning it into more of a people-oriented place and trialing it quickly and taking the learning you get from that, the data you get from that, and kind of having a fast fail approach. So you can sort of trial it, see how it goes and expand it or not. And this was one of the ways that Manhattan quite quickly transformed some of their really busy traffic areas into big public plazas that then ended up becoming permanent or pedestrianized areas in Times Square, for example. And we found that councils were really struggling to put in place extended footpaths or separated cycleways or little public plaza spaces because firstly, they'd have massive consultation requirements, and inevitably, anytime you propose any change to the street environment, somebody gets really upset about it and argues that it's going to be the death of their commercial district. And also, it sort of meant that transport planning has been very kind of theory-based as opposed to empirical. So you get the whole community debating like some pictures on a paper, but not really getting to experience it in real life and see how it works, collect data before you make these big, long, permanent decisions. And so there have been streets like Ponsonby Road and Dominion Road that we've been talking about upgrading for like over a decade, and nothing has really happened. And so it's just very high stakes. It's like you have to get it all perfect before you do anything. And then, that prevents us from doing things quickly, getting the community to be able to see how it will change. And so the shopkeepers can see, okay, well, actually people still came to my shop, even though these 3 car parks right in front of it were not there for a month or 2. So I think that approach, again, a big council like Auckland Council has the resources, through the Auckland Design Office, they did anyway. And Auckland Transport has the resources to have specialists in this area. But outside of Auckland, councils aren't as well resourced. And so we're trying to get the New Zealand Transport Agency to develop that guidance to have, for this fund, the board has signed off a 90% subsidy, which is really exciting, which means that councils have a real incentive to trial this new approach. And we had to get around that requirement, this onerous requirement for all this consultation. If we're just doing temporary changes, we need to have a way to do that so we can gather data rather than having to go out and do 6 weeks of consultation for something which ended up becoming a major barrier to doing anything at all.
I'm just going to thank you very much there. I'm just going to pick up some questions from the floor and I'll come back myself. I've got one here from Anthony that says, what are your views on the current and draft government policy statement on transport?
Well, I think the current government policy statement on transport funding was pretty good. It signaled a big change in direction. because a lot of the really big projects in the new state highways category in particular were things that have to be contracted years in advance. We weren't able to redirect as much in the initial 3-year NLTF to public transport and rapid transit, and even walking and cycling, as I personally would have liked, but we still did signal a big change in direction. In the draft, I think it's probably the first 3 years that are the most important to look at. Once you go further out, it starts to be, you know, who knows what's going to happen. With COVID-19, I think I didn't quite get back to that, Lee, in answer to your first question. It did shows how quickly big changes can be made for the good of the community. And I think that during lockdown level 4, which was probably very challenging for some people, many also experienced the benefits of having quieter neighborhoods, reduced traffic, people being able to get out on their bikes with families on their bikes and feel safe, and seeing lots of their neighbors out and about from a distance was kind of nice, as you say. And so I think that kind of opened up a window in which we could see, actually, we could do things differently, and it could bring us some huge benefits. And with climate change in particular, I think the work of the Climate Commission is going to be instrumental, and the budgeting is going to be really important across all different sectors. But I already have heard from the chair of the Climate Commission and other experts that transport is going to have to, you know, pull a lot of the weight in the next 10 years. And so that might mean that we have to make even bigger changes to our funding priorities. And with COVID-19, also, we're obviously borrowing and committing a lot of funding to stimulate the economy. And so that's going to potentially limit us, you know, in 5 years' time. So we have to be really careful about what we choose to prioritize in the next 18 months, because it's going to have repercussions for the next decade.
And just picking up that point we were discussing before about the shovel-ready projects and the 11 fast-track projects, what were you involved in? Was there any? Do you have any insights to the rationale of why those projects were chosen vis-a-vis what we've just been discussing?
So the projects that have already been announced as being potentially able to go through the fast track process, I mean, that legislation is still in front of the select committee. So just for those who aren't total Parliament nerds, the way that it works for the bill to become a law is it has to have a first reading, go to a select committee. I believe there's going to be hearings on that bill all day tomorrow. And then it would have to go through a second and a third reading. And I would just say the Greens supported at the first reading, but we still have some pretty big concerns about the approach. I have a briefing here from the Ministry for the Environment, which talks about the prioritization or the criteria that were used to identify these projects. And impact on climate was certainly one of the criteria, and the number of jobs that it would create is another criteria, and readiness to start construction was a further criteria. I assume that this briefing, if it's not already public, will be proactively released in the next few months. I wasn't directly involved in choosing projects, but I would say that generally I think that the assessment that was put forward by the Ministry for the Environment was pretty good. And yeah.
Okay, cool. I've got another question from the floor. This one from Rebecca. She says, what are your thoughts on the MOT's green freight studies, findings, options and actions and timeframes?
I think it's good. I think we need to be moving a lot faster on it, to be honest. But hey, we came into government, we really changed direction from the previous government. And I think it turns out once you get into government, everything takes a lot longer than you think it should. But particularly if capacity within the public service and the Ministry of Transport and New Zealand Transport Agency had all been geared up to kind of go in a slightly different direction, or a completely different direction in some cases, that it takes time to kind of build up the capacity and the advice to do other things. And you can't prioritize everything all at once. While green freight's really, really important, I think obviously it's taken a backseat compared to the work we had to do on the government policy statement overall, some of the work that we did on vehicle emissions. I think I see an opportunity with biofuels to reduce emissions, particularly from diesel and heavy vehicles. You can make small reductions quite quickly, and you don't have to wait for new technology. It's something you can drop in immediately. But you know, obviously it's going to take some time, and it can take up to 18 months for a policy like that to work its way through a normal legislative process. Back in 2007, 2008, they were working on a biofuels mandate, and then the national government just canned that work, and nothing happened for 9 years. And then, you know, we're just getting it on our work program now. I think mode shift for freight is not completely unrealistic. We are investing a lot in the rail network. I know the Minister of Transport is very passionate about coastal shipping, but it's been less clear what we can do to incentivize a shift to more coastal shipping, aside from, you know, when earthquakes knocked out State Highway 1 and the rail line, there was a big shift to coastal shipping quite quickly, and it did work. So there's a question about how we as a government can provide the right incentives to enable momentum where that makes sense. And then the longer term question around technology is whether electrification of heavy vehicles or hydrogen is going to be the best option, green hydrogen for those heavy vehicles. And I think I'm hopeful that in the next month, there will be some announcements about decisions for further infrastructure investment that will show that we are very much committed to green freight, and some of the opportunities will start in the next year.
And just on, dare I ask the question about the light rail down Dominion Road?
Well, I think there's going to be a government announcement on that very, very soon, which makes it difficult for me to talk about it right now tonight. What I can say is, obviously for me and the Green Party, this was a high priority project because it had already been well developed by Auckland Transport and the New Zealand Transport Agency, but that you know, we're in a coalition government, and other parties wanted to investigate other alternatives like full grade separation for the line. And that's what led to this sort of twin track process being pursued between New Zealand Infra, which is the Superfund, and CDPQ from Quebec, which would be like a kind of PPP. They're calling it public-public partnership, because it's the Superfund and another kind of publicly owned investment agency from another country, from Canada. But the idea was to set it up kind of more like with that entity delivering the infrastructure and then kind of operating it over a very long period of time. And the alternative was a similar type of proposal from the New Zealand Transport Agency. So that's, I think, why it has taken longer, because some parties wanted to investigate alternative approaches to delivery. And I think that we will start to see a lot of progress on that in the next few months, and especially depending on the outcome of the election.
Okay. A question here from Ivan. It says, thank you very much. Really good problem definition. On the other hand, how do you envision that we could improve Aotearoa cities' resilience and making them first people's places without huge economic investment, and most importantly, without the support, with the support from the general public?
I think that's the trickiest part. Is I think that there is strong public support for public transport, for more cycle-friendly and pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, but there's also inevitably loud opposition to any proposed change, both to zoning that allows higher density in some parts of the city, and to reallocation of road space, which is necessary to provide priority for public transport and safe access for people who are on active modes, walking, cycling, scooting. So that's the big challenge. And when you ask people what they want, like post Christchurch earthquakes, the council ran this share an idea process, and what came out of it was very much a kind of green, people-friendly city. And when you know, I know they do surveys at Wellington City that say 2/3 of adults in Wellington would cycle if they felt the safe infrastructure was available to them, especially now that there's e-bikes to deal with the hills and the headwinds. But anytime you go to remove car parks or narrow a lane of traffic in order to put that safe cycling infrastructure in, a minority of people usually object. It's usually a small number, but they tend to get the most attention from the local media, and then the politicians get very afraid, and and then you don't see as much progress. So I'm hopeful that the tactical urbanism approach will enable us to try more things and to bring the community along. I also think we need better representative consultation processes that make sure we're hearing from the entire community and not just over-representing the views of a small number of people. And I think ultimately we need to have some objective measures of success that we use to kind of measure the outcomes of what we're doing, because I think if we don't have those, like, let's say it would be guidelines that say once you have a certain volume and speed of traffic, you automatically have to put in a safe separated cycle lane if it's on a route that is a major connection for a cycle network. Or, and it doesn't even become, it has been technocratic decisions that have led us to this very car dependent landscape. And you almost need to take it back to changing those technocratic decisions in a way that supports the outcomes that the community wants. So keep the high level vision, the decision that's defined by the public, and then use some really objective measures to guide what infrastructure goes where. Same with frequent public transport. In order to achieve really reliable, frequent public transport, you do need to give buses priority. And I think that just can't be a local political decision. It's got to be a little bit separated.
And just on that, I have a question here from Nico that talks about, he says here, in other cities around the world, they actively restrict development in greenfield spaces to within 800 meters of rapid transit stations. Could we have an NPS, for those people who don't know what that means, that's a national policy statement under the Resource Management Act, in New Zealand to require something similar? What do you think about your views and as Associate Minister of Transport on that?
So I was in Denmark and I was meeting their head of their housing, kind of almost like their ministry for housing and urban development. And he was a civil servant, but I think the civil service is a little bit more political there. This was before they had the change of government. So this is when they had a center right, or fairly right wing actually, government. And he was the one who proudly told me they don't allow any new housing development anywhere in the country unless it's within 800 meters of a train station or a public transport stop. And I thought that was really amazing, and goes to show just how different the political spectrum is there. I think that in New Zealand, that would be considered quite a radical move. And in the first instance, I would just like to get us into a more sensible approach on spatial planning, and hopefully the MPS, which, the final version of which should be announced pretty soon, will go a long way to removing the barriers to high quality urban amenity and density. And once you've removed those barriers, maybe in the future, you can look at how you provide more incentives. I know that the Minister of Urban Development and Transport has spoken about a desire to make sure that spatial planning is reflecting the full impact, and that will probably result in more greenfields, areas that have particular environmental value, whether that's high quality soils for growing food or sensitive wetlands. They should be protected more under that approach to spatial planning, so that the new greenfields development we do get is in a place where it makes sense to have new development, and also that it has public transport connections built in from the beginning.
Just a Thank you very much for taking these questions. This is fantastic, and thanks for everyone who's sending them through. I've got another one here from Rebecca. Your graph showed a big increase in emissions from transport around 2013. Is this because of SUVs? And what is happening to flatten the curve? And would an EV subsidy is the EV subsidy going ahead?
The EV subsidy, which wasn't a direct subsidy, by the way, it is we called it the clean car discount. It is a fee bait, which says, the more polluting vehicles pay a little bit extra, and that directly finances your discounts on your lower emitting vehicles. The biggest discounts go to pure EVs or zero emission vehicles, but even hybrids would get a bit of a discount under the proposal we put forward. We haven't been able to get support from one of the coalition parties for that policy. And so I'm, quite frustrated that we haven't been able to make progress on that issue, but I'm very confident that if the parties that are returned to government are, supportive, then it can happen quite quickly. And not just the fee bait, but also a fuel efficiency standard. And those two policies really work together to reduce the emissions from the light fleet. I do think that around 2013, we suddenly started, we had a bump and started to have growth in new vehicle imports, because that really slowed down after the GFC in end of 2008, 2009. We saw a big decline in the number of vehicles that were being imported. And then from 2013, it really started to take off again. And in the top 10 most popular vehicles that are being imported are a number of double cab utes and SUVs, which are, less fuel efficient. So we absolutely need some incentives in place and some standards if we're going to reduce emissions. And all I can say is party vote green, and and we can make that happen. I think that there's also more, as I said before, to be done on freight mode shift and incentives for heavy vehicles as well to be more efficient.
Another question here from Mustafa, and I think this is quite a good one, and it comes back to the urban growth agenda that, I think is obviously going to slightly change as we've discussed and where we've been with COVID, but they're asking the question, what do you think is the better option for public transport, electric buses or electric trains in Auckland?
I think both. Electric trains have been really successful. I'm really proud of that achievement, because the Green Party did have a big campaign. That's when I joined the Greens in 2006 to get electrification of Auckland's rail network, or 2007. And that finally got delivered in 2008, but we didn't actually see the electric trains on there, till 2015. So these things take time. Buses will continue to be really important to Auckland's public transport network. And if they're really run well, then they're not competing with the rail line, but they're serving the rail line and they're providing those feeder services, or they're providing services where there is no rail line, and there's still plenty of places in Auckland that don't have a rail line and probably won't for at least another 5 to 10 years. So we really do need to transition to electric buses, and there won't just be benefits for the climate. They are quieter, they can be cheaper to run, and there's less particulates, harmful diesel particulates, which are actually can be quite problematic for people's health, especially in places like Queen Street, which is a bit of a valley.
So just picking up, I'm just going to ask a question of my own, picking up the point you made, which is very well made, about transport and doing the lifting there. Some colleagues at Massey University talked about the building materials and the things associated with this, energy consumption of housing, size of housing, and if we continue on the project we're on now, we're probably going to exceed and you talked about our Paris obligations and they were suggesting 5%. What's your feeling in terms of growth, urban growth, in terms of size of housing and building materials and things along those lines?
Well, this government is taking a much more active role in the provision of housing, and I think that is a real opportunity. With Kainga Ora, thousands of new state homes are being provided, and I know that they have a commitment to Green Star Level 6 minimum, that they're looking at a much more integrated typology. So rather than just standalone houses in a really car dependent neighborhood, they are trying to build in those, complete community approach, which would include, cycleways and public transport and hopefully other services and amenities in the neighborhood. So it's not just all houses. Also, the urban development, there's a bill that's kind of currently in progress, which is about setting up an urban development authority, which means that government can take even more of a proactive approach into how development occurs. And I think that's really our biggest opportunity, especially now in the post-COVID environment, where we might see a bit of a reduction in immigration in the short term. In the medium to long term, we might see a real increase in the demand to live in New Zealand. And it's really important where development happens, I'd say kind of in the most best practice way. Governments, city or central governments, are usually very involved in the development process. The community can be really involved in developing the structure plan, and the private sector is really there just to deliver the buildings, and those need to be to a high standard. So, low waste, low water use, energy efficient, it's healthier, it's better for the tenants or the owners of the property because they spend less heating their home. So there's huge opportunities there, and I think that our government absolutely needs to be leading in this area with our state house developments and with future projects of the Urban Development Authority.
I've got one last question that unfortunately doesn't have a name attached to it, but it's something I have to say in my role on the UDF, the Urban Design Forum, we've made submissions on this as well. And it's the idea of maybe in New South Wales, you have the Office of the Government Architect, maybe it's an architect or something of that thing, about being an independent body looking at promoting good quality design, a bit like what you had CABE in the UK, and as I say, New South Wales, you have the State Office of the State Architect, whether that's an urban designer, architect or built, whatever. What's your feelings on that sort of independent body to improve the quality of design throughout a city, especially Auckland?
I think it has a lot of merit. I can't say if there's any particular development happening to make that happen, but I certainly think it has a lot of merit and that it's something the government should have its eye on.
Okay. I think I've got one last question here. It's from George. In the UK, Transport for London's Mini Holland project program has delivered statistically significant increases in walking and cycling levels throughout the changing existing streets based on international best practice. Is there potential to try something similar in New Zealand?
Well, yeah, again, I think that the tactical urbanism is probably our first step into that approach. I do think that, as this decade goes by, we're going to have to be thinking in a much more ambitious way about what is possible and what is necessary to address climate change, but also to have healthier, happier, more people-friendly towns and cities. And I'm really, really hopeful that we can catch up with other parts of the world in this area.
Okay, we're just coming up to, wait there, I think we've got room for one last one. It's from Rebecca. And then I think we'll just call it because we've run up to time. And I'll just say it's lovely to see your son there. And it's great to have them there in the background. It's great. What's Rebecca say? Sorry, not Rebecca, Rachel. I completely agree with your comments about not being able to build your own way of congestion. Should we be looking at removing consideration of congestion levels of service impacts for development through the NPS? Currently, it's a handbrake on intensification.
That's really interesting. I'm interested to know exactly how that works as a handbrake at the moment, whether that's just through the practice of the council or whether it's something that's explicitly set out. I don't believe it's explicitly set out in district plans, but maybe I'm wrong. I think it's more something that's done through the practice of traffic engineering and their assessment of environmental impacts. And that makes it a little bit harder to change through a national policy statement because that's usually just guiding the policies or objectives and rules in the district plan. Whereas I think what it is an effect, all right, so Rachel's added, it's an effect under the RMA. Any discretionary activity gets pinged for traffic effects. It is, again, I don't think it's explicitly mentioned in the RMA that levels of service for vehicles or congestion is an amenity, but I think that it ends up through the practice of what the consultant engineers and the council engineers are saying, it does get considered. And so that is something that I think really needs to be driven through the professional practice of traffic engineers, and very, very happy to raise it with the particularly, you know, NZTA, and I think it's something that potentially NZTA could address through some of its guidance for engineers, both consultants and at the council level. But I think Auckland Transport would be a good place to start, and I can raise that with the people I speak to at Auckland Transport and see where does the change need to happen so that this stops being a barrier.
Yeah, I think it's a practice issue between the traffic engineers. Just while we're talking about the RMA, and don't want to dwell on that, but what do you think about the work, and not getting you to talk out of school or anything, but the work that Justice Randerson's been doing in the direction with the potential changes to the Resource Management Act? What's your feelings on those?
When we met with the panel, I was pretty encouraged with what they said they were looking at. So I'm eager to see what the outcome is. I don't think we've seen the specific recommendations yet for all of the changes. Some of it is happening, but the longer term changes.
All right, I think we're just rolling around to 7:30, and we've taken our hour of your time. And I'd just really like to thank you again for making the time available. And it's lovely to see you again, to come along tonight and be the first, or our second speaker in our restart of our program for the Fast Forward. That's a really important thing for us, as you know, as a graduate of the school. It's really important for our school to be outreaching with the community with our built form disciplines. So thanks very much. Have a lovely night, and I'm sure you see you again. And just before everyone goes, I'd just like to, speaking of the Minister of Urban Development, the Honourable Phil Twyford is coming up next, and he's going to be talking about the UDAs and the Urban Development Authority. So we're looking forward to that, which is coming forward later on in July. So have a good night, everyone. Thank you again, Julie Anne. It's been a pleasure to have you all here with us tonight, and thank you on behalf of the University for your time, and good night. Thank you.